And then I will go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Amy Stiffarm, who we are very thrilled to have joining us again today.
Great. Thank you guys. Thank you all. And thanks to the Moms Program for asking me to come and present again and go a little bit more in depth on working with Indigenous communities in an appropriate way, especially when we're thinking of the perinatal health period. Can everybody see my slides okay? Great. I also just wanted to preference that, you know, DEI is really not my specialty. But that being said, like I have seen some good examples of allyship in the work, and I've heard of it. I've also heard of like not so good examples. So we're just going to go through. If anyone has anything else to share, please come off mute, share in the chat. Be happy to hear and get an opportunity for kind of like this co-learning space. So that being said, let's just get into it. Make sure I can move my slides. So before we get started, I do want to take the time to give a land acknowledgement. I'm calling in from Helena, which is some common grounds and was occupied or utilized by some of my people, Ani and the Amskapi Pakani. So whenever we start an event or wherever we have a place of business or where our nonprofit is, where our house is, where we're going to school, anywhere you are really, maybe it's an event, it's really important to position and think about on and who had to sacrifice that land and who was removed from that land so that that building or house or whatnot could be there. And when I talk about the land, like Indigenous use of the land, I don't necessarily mean ownership. It wasn't viewed as ownership. It was more of a relationship, a reciprocal relationship where we, Indigenous people, our ancestors took care of the land, and in return, the land took care of them. So I just think it's always important to acknowledge that. And in addition to doing a land acknowledgement, it's always great if you can take it a step further, you know, for the sake of talking about inclusion in this type of work. It'd be great if you could, you know, make a donation to a local Indigenous organization or offer discounts to Indigenous people that are attending your event. I've seen some like trail races in Montana do that, where there are discounts for peoples whose land the race is taking place on. And so things like that are really important. And also when like crafting a land acknowledgement, make sure that that's like a thoughtful process and that you're really, you know, instead of reusing like somebody else's land acknowledgement, you really want to take time and invest in that. If you need help, you can hire an Indigenous consultant to work on that with you. But that's some information about land acknowledgements. I also quickly want to give my positionality so that people understand like why I'm in this work. I am originally from Fort Belknap, and I'm also Chippewa Cree and Blackfeet, but I'm enrolled Aani or White Clay. And what kind of brings me to this work, like what's in my heart about this is I was first tribal college educated, and so throughout my undergrad, while I was learning like scientific methods and research and taking biochem, things like that, I was also, all classes were required to be rooted in culture. And that was my first required class of taking federal or history of Indians in the US. And so looking at kind of like the real history of the United States and how that impacted many Indigenous people in the US. And, and so that was really helpful. And I didn't realize how helpful that would be until like now. In my master's of public health, I had my 2 babies and I became really interested in breastfeeding. And also with my second pregnancy, I struggled with my perinatal mental health. I had depression during pregnancy and depression and anxiety postpartum. So when I went back for my PhD, I was really interested in support and trying to understand how to, instead of solely focusing on breastfeeding, how to make it more expansive. And kind of always kept coming back to support and looking at perinatal mental health and the lack of research and whatnot there was on that subject. So I've been able to do a lot of work. This here, the bottom picture is a national gathering of Indigenous birth workers and advocates working on advancing Indigenous birth justice. But I've also been able to do a lot of work in Montana, which really I'm really grateful for, because all of my research before this has always been like out of state with other tribes. So I think this is just really, I feel really good about being able to do this kind of work in this state. And it also helps me too, because when you're growing, you are a patient in the healthcare system, or you are going to border towns and whatnot. I didn't always have the best experience as an Indigenous woman or an Indigenous person. And looking at the literature and whatnot, it was easy to become jaded. I like, oh man, people don't care, or like that's what it felt like. But the more work that I do in the state, the more I'm able to see that people do care. They just don't know where to start. And so I just like to thank everybody for showing up today and opening your minds and being willing to learn more. So when people give their positionality statement, it's really common with a lot of Indigenous scholars. You'll see it a lot more in the like scientific articles or the literature. It's really important for us to position ourselves so that people can see who we are, why we're interested in this type of work. And that's important when you're working in tribal communities. It's really not the same as a credential statement. And it's important too, when someone shares their positionality with you, or they say their tribal affiliation and let you know who they are, then you should use that. Like if I send someone for my presentation and they ask for my title, and I'll try to remember to include like Ani, Chippewa Cree, Blackfeet after my name before I put my PhD and PhD degree. I give that for a reason, because it's part of who I am, and it's how other Native people in any Native people are. It's part of my identity. So if like a patient or somebody, promotional materials or whatnot, if somebody gives you that information, be sure to use it. So when we're talking about allyship and appropriation, it really all comes back to cultural safety. So I just wanted to kind of ground us a little bit in what it means to be culturally safe. And we're kind of just taking all of these other definitions about sensitivity, competence, humility, and kind of like sort of combining them, but making sure that like they're all related to cultural safety. So cultural safety is having awareness of power relationships and addressing them by implementing reflective practice and allowing the patient to determine whether a clinical encounter is safe. So it's not a static state. It's not like you become culturally safe. It's continuously addressing. That's like a verb, addressing and implementing reflective practice. So I wanted to share, like I said, I'm not a DEI expert, but I wanted to share some information on what helped me when I was, as a student, kind of putting language to some of the things I've experienced, like in healthcare or prior education or a whole bunch of other places. And really and working alongside of non-Native students in the program that were working through these kind of these like identity and the whys and all of that. So it was a really thought-provoking assignment to read these papers and to discuss them with my classmates. And I wanted to share them with you. And I do have some resources. Actually, that reminds me, I'm going to try to pause and just put some stuff in the chat, but these will be shared with you all too after. Okay. There we go. So this is just a paper that I reference a lot when I'm talking about allyship. You know, I don't really even say ally. I try to say someone who practices allyship, because again, it's being an ally can be misunderstood as like a static state versus something that someone continuously needs to practice. So this paper where these images are from are the coin model of privilege and critical allyship. So this is just talking about like a coin being the system of inequality, and there's people with privilege, and then there's oppression. And so if you're at the top of the coin, then you have advantages that other people don't, and you have they're advantages that you did not earn, like the color of your gender. And so the coin is social structures that maintain inequity. So white supremacy, sexism, ableism. And then at the bottom of the coin it's thinking of those disadvantages that, again, like we didn't ask for or didn't earn. Just it's about who we happen to be. So this goes into it a little bit more further to give you the example, and give you examples. And this paper is really talking about how it varies, right? Like some like I'm Native, or well, pretend I wasn't. Well, say I'm Native, but what if I was male, right? And I'm straight, and I'm cis. So you know, I can go back and forth on these different sides of the coin. Which makes it causes all these like different intersections and sort of unclear, or can cause people to be a little bit confused on what privileges they benefit from, and you know, really understanding the privileges that they have. So this paper is really good about that and helping people understand more. I'm going to get into it a little bit more, some of my favorite parts of the paper, and it's a really easy read. So critical allyship addresses social inequalities as an ongoing practice, right? So it's not a static state. You just don't become an ally. And then it's like it's an earned, you're not just an ally because you don't think that you're racist, you know, like there's ongoing practice that has to take place to practice critical allyship. And why it's like critical is because it's requiring us to really reorient the way we're thinking about things. Like we kind of, even me as an Indigenous person who's like Western educated, it takes a lot of unlearning to think about these things. And I myself have found myself in situations where I'm like, oh wait, this is probably not the best way to do this. And I'll talk about some examples later too. So what was helpful language from this paper is reorienting your motivation from I want to help those who are less fortunate, or I'm going to use my expertise to reduce inequities for these certain. And you need to move from that. I seek to understand my role in upholding systems of oppression that are creating these health inequities. And also I learned from the expertise of and in solidarity with historically marginalized groups to help me understand and take action on systems of inequality. So, it's called critical allyship because it's being critical of yourself. These are some principles that I pulled from the paper. So how to practice critical allyship. It's not about saving or fixing people on the bottom of the coin. And this reminds me of the white savior complex. And that's an idea in which a white person or white culture feels as though they know what's best for Black or Indigenous or other people of color. Um, and that's a really common thing, especially in health interventions. The other principle, take active steps to learn about the systems of inequality for which one is in a position of privilege. So really, people from outside of Indigenous communities have to be critical of themselves and be able to recognize if your interest in the project comes from a place of saviorism. For people in positions of privilege, it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable to be critical and like be thinking of these things. And like I said, I've witnessed a lot of discomfort around this paper in particular. But watching people work through that, I just really respected them. And, they were so brave. It's a brave thing to do. But it's important to remember that it's uncomfortable, but it rarely leads to a lack of safety, which people who are on the bottom side of the coin, who are impressed, like we often experience threats to our safety on like a regular basis. So trying to be okay with that discomfort. Also, recognizing the need for action at the systemic, institutional, interpersonal, and internal levels. So it's going to take multiple efforts, right, to dismantle these systems of oppression. And then do not use, oops, I skipped, decenter yourself or step back. So that's really ensuring that the voices, the worldviews, values of the community are centered, and really be mindful of emotional labor. And I'm going to go into that a little bit later. Whoops, one more. And a key principle is really recognizing and resisting the urge to use allyship to advance one's own power. So one should not practice, you're not practicing allyship to be seen performing or to be performative. And another term for this is optical allyship, which I had never heard before until kind of trying to read up on some of the new information that's out there. But really, we should be actively resisting special recognition for confronting issues that other people deal with every day of their lives. So really thinking about like, why am I doing this? There are things that like just happen. Like if you're, I would say like in research and whatnot, this happens a lot where, or in health promotion, where you do a certain project with Indigenous people and it's like, oh, wow, look what I did, or look at, kind of centering yourself in the work. And also it can get really tricky and icky when it's about funding, like, are you benefiting? Are you getting this grant so that you can have another year of work versus what resources do you have and how are you ensuring that those resources get to the community that needs them the most? And so there's a balance in this. And as long as you're, continuously being reflective and considering these principles, then you should be okay. I wanted to talk about cultural appropriation because this is, it honestly worries me a little bit, and I try to remember to say this whenever I'm talking about like cultural strengths in some of my cultural safety presentations. I really love talking about cultural strength and getting to know that the people you serve. Um, but I get really nervous about people taking those strengths and trying to implement them themselves if they're a non-native person. And it's kind of like, I know we're in these systems that often make it difficult to do some of this work. And that's where practicing good allyship comes into. Like, go to the funders, explain to them for us about why it's important to have extra time on or to why this funding is going for something that maybe is important to Indigenous communities, like a feed or paying an elder, things like that. So I get nervous that people are gonna, some people might like take them and run with them versus really investing in Indigenous-led work. So cultural appropriation is really modern day colonization. A better, more thorough definition is a particular power dynamic in which members of a dominant culture take elements from a culture of people who have been systematically oppressed by that dominant group. So taking something from another culture without giving proper recognition or respect to that culture, or claiming to be from that culture when you're not. And we've been seeing a lot of that in academia, actually, where people, professors, it's become known that they had been claiming to be Native, and it turns out they're not, but they got so many like grants and even the positions that they were in from claiming to be Native. So one thing that the MOMS program does with the Indigenous doula trainings, it's not the Zagitawin training, they're open to everybody, and it's about like helping people better understand how to support Indigenous families in prenatal, pregnancy, and postpartum. But one thing that the MOMS program does in the application is it has them linked to community. Like, are you serving an Indigenous community? So thinking of like those steps of when you're hiring people and to come to your event to speak, or citing papers, how can you ensure that you're promoting like Indigenous-led work and not accidentally supporting somebody who is causing harm in Indigenous communities by falsely claiming that they're Native? And those are just things to be mindful of, and they're all over the news. I don't, you could do a Google and learn way more. But cultural appropriation can perpetuate stereotypes and exploit groups that are discriminated against. I'll give some more examples, but one thing that we see a lot of is like these smudge kits. I found this, did a quick Google search, and it's a smudge gift box from Shaman's Market. And I don't know what it's like, white sage, and I'm not sure, if the feathers are real. It's an abalone shell, and I don't know what other part is. But instead of doing something like this, like, it's probably easier to like bulk order and do this. If you have the means, you should be investing in local resources. Buy local. Invest in local artists and in craftsmanship, and whenever you can. So like, people are talking about moccasin kits in NICUs, or to give to parents for parenting classes or whatnot. You, there might be from some like non-native owned company online where you can buy those, but really you should invest in local community, people from that community, to make those moccasin kits. Because not only we can't assume that every moccasin style is the same. So that's one reason why it's important, because moccasin styles do vary from tribe to tribe. But it's just a sign of respect to invest in the local community. And there's another resource. Oh, cool. I think Val shared those. All right. So other examples where this comes up in wellness and the Native Governance actually had a really, the Native Governance Center had a really nice quick read about where this shows up in wellness spaces. So it wasn't really like hospital spaces, but yoga, I've heard of that a lot because it's appropriated because when it's appropriated, the person isn't like giving credit or respect to like the people who originally practiced yoga, and they're, you know, they're not acknowledging like who taught them it. So that's something to think about. Um, and if in your clinic or your office, you know, if you're going to be having if you want to make Indigenous people comfortable, then I think it's important to be mindful of where your materials are coming from and if they're appropriated or not. So cultural appreciation is really, it's like the opposite of cultural appropriation. It's celebrating or showing respect or honor for a culture. Things like dressing appropriately for a cultural event you're invited to. That I wanted to share a picture of the doulas because I remember I was at one of the Indigenous doula trainings, and I totally just witnessed this. Like I was not a part of this at all. But there was a person who I believe they were non-native and they didn't have a ribbon skirt. And like the last day, everybody takes pictures and stuff. And this girl came down with a ribbon skirt who was native, and she asked that woman if she wanted to borrow it for the picture. And she was just so happy and grateful. And I was like over there like, oh man, that's so nice. And so it's, if you're buying like a ribbon skirt or earrings from an Indigenous person, that's appreciation. That's not appropriation. If you're like learning to make ribbon skirts and you're non-native and you're making a profit off of it, that's appropriation. And appropriation is even more like concerning when there's money involved, when there's profit involved. So that's why, you know, it's different than celebrating the culture and showing respect or honor for it. And also kind of mentioned this before, like seeking that knowledge from people who are a part of that community. And these are some ways to like give credit when it's due. Where did the knowledge or practice come from? Who did you learn it from? Is it part of your ancestry or not? Did you get permission to, you know, sing this song or do this? And this is even for like Indigenous people, it's kind of, I think, comes a little bit natural. Like we tend to, when we're talking about teachings, we'll say, oh, like my aunt had told me, or so-and-so taught this to me, or so-and-so gave me the permission to sing this song. You hear it a lot. So it's kind of common there too. Like we're trying to be very careful about acknowledging where the knowledge came from, and that it's also a way of like so we're not just making it up. And then finally, like, how can I support the community in which this practice originates? So kind of going back to yoga, like, are there ways that you're giving back to the country that yoga originates from, or the ancestry? So educating others, giving credit when it's due, celebrating culture are all ways to prevent cultural appropriation. I said I was going to talk a little bit about emotional labor. This picture, it just cracks me up because I typed into like Microsoft Office like stress and that came up because that's what it reminds me of. There's been a lot of talk about emotional labor, which is really good. I hear it a lot in domestic partnerships mostly, and I think that's really good. And I am very vocal to my boyfriend, but also to my kids about like invisible work and whatnot, and like this is why mom needs to think, and I'm just trying to like get stuff into their vocabulary and understanding at a young age so that they're able to recognize when maybe they're doing like emotional labor. But emotional labor is unpaid, invisible work that a person is compelled to do by others, like to keep them happy or in a job. This can come up. Ways this comes up that I've seen is like reaching out to those that we consider community leaders or experts for help before we even try to do our own research. And doing that for free, like people expecting that for free. Maybe with our patients, this is another part that I get concerned about when I stress how important it is to learn about the culture. And I really try to tell people that you're going to do that from engaging with the communities, not from like asking your patients about their culture. And that's emotional labor, asking somebody to explain something to you. Me and my job and my position at HMHB, I get to do this stuff. Like I get to help people. So I try to encourage people, like, send me an email or, try to find out on your own, of course. Like, don't ask me something Google could ask you or Google could answer for you. But if you're interested in like doing something around cultural safety or whatnot, and you're one of the you're an organization that we work with, like we can do that for you. I'd rather have you come to me than like ask a patient or even like someone on your staff who's Native. That's also emotional labor, because is it in their job description? Are they getting extra compensation to inform your staff? And a lot of us do that. A lot of us will do it because we care and we want people to do a good job when they're interacting with Indigenous patients and whatnot. But it's still emotional labor. And research has shown that women do this more than men, especially women, Indigenous and Black women. And it can affect our mental health and even our physical health. It has been proven like how stress impacts women more. There's different articles, I didn't include them, but stuff like about weathering for BIPOC women, about this kind of stress and how it's like literally bad for our health to be taking on like additional emotional labor. And it's a tricky place to be because, we're talking about power dynamics too. If it's your boss and they're asking you about culture, or the culture of a patient, or you're having to explain things on the spot, it's a tricky place to be. And it's different if you have like a friend and you're asking them, or they're visiting you, or you guys are visiting and something comes up and they're sharing their culture with you. That's different. But I think it's just good practice when you're talking about allyship to say, is this something that I can ask you, or do you think I should? And really like the best thing to do, especially if it's like work related, is to hire someone Indigenous to help educate and do these things, especially if you're talking about educating your staff. So one example I wanted to give was our strategy to support perinatal mental health by collaborating with tribal communities in Montana. So this is actually the paper that just came out in Health Affairs, and I wanted to pull out some of like my favorite parts to talk about it. I'm going to check the chat really quick. Okay. If there's any questions or comments, feel free to put them in the chat too. I know it could be like uncomfortable, but if you're willing to share, please do. So our LIFTS resource guide, HMHB kind of came up with this idea to do a statewide resource guide, because not just for parents and caregivers, they were struggling to find resources within their community, but in Montana, a lot of rural communities, we travel to Havre or Billings or Great Falls for our healthcare needs. And so if you have a doctor or a provider in Great Falls that's seeing somebody from like Chinook or Harlem, they can use the LIFTS resource guide to see what kind of resources are there. And so it's a really great resource. But one thing that was really, really cool was, the moms program invested in that. And they were all, HMHB and the moms program were like, okay, but who's gonna do the work for the reservations? And it was very clear to everybody that it needed to be an Indigenous person to lead that work. So I was able to, they asked me to do it on contract, and I just thought that was so cool right away. And I'll tell you that I have like turned down contracting jobs before because things were like kind of weird, right? And so I've had to turn down jobs where people are really disparity focused and they want me to talk about all the bad things that are wrong in Indigenous communities, or and I've had to say, no, I would never like put my name on that, like, and I have accountability to my community and to my parents. I always think of like, oh my gosh, my mom and dad would be so mad at me if they thought that I um agreed with that. So I'm very cautious about who I work with. And when they came to me with that, like, we know we're not the ones to do this. We want to invest in Indigenous graduate student to do this work. I was like, okay, let's go, let's do this. So why, for the paper, I wrote a health affairs article talking about how to engage with tribal communities. And for me, it became really important to talk about it because I learned a lot of lessons from this. We called it Lifts in Indian Country. But really, it kind of starts from the scientific literature, or the articles out there about perinatal mental health. We know that there are higher rates. We know that mental health conditions are the leading cause of death among American Indian women and birthing people. But there was quite a bit missing. The articles weren't really inclusive. They weren't including Indigenous communities. They lacked a strength-based focus. They were super deficit-based, which can perpetuate stereotypes, and also use language that is very blaming. Like, it puts the blame on the communities or the population for the situations that are happening. There wasn't a lot of Indigenous-led research, and hardly any of the literature was based on traditional knowledge or the cultural values of the community. And within the research itself, there wasn't a lot of culturally appropriate research methodologies. So we did the Lifts in Indian Country project, and this was kind of stuff that we learned as we were going and after the fact. But I just want to like set the stage a little bit. So in the paper, I talk about realities that are influencing perinatal mental health work in tribal communities. So recognizing that Indigenous communities have unique social determinants of health, things that are related to like racism and colonization and whatnot. The second being that Eurocentric research and interventions developed for the general population are often pushed onto Indigenous populations. So I just talked about the research. All of that is from a Western perspective, right? So Eurocentric just means think like how Europe Europe dominated ways of thinking. So when we're only doing research or we're only looking at health interventions that are based on something other than Indigenous culture, that's what's in the literature. And so that's what's evidence-based. And so that's what everyone thinks works. So they're doing something for the general population, and they're just like trying to fix it onto Indigenous communities. And we're learning more and more like how ineffective and sometimes harmful and dangerous that can be. And thirdly, this reality is knowing that we can't approach this work thinking we have the solutions to tribal communities' problems, right? We have to acknowledge the issues with white saviorism. And when we're doing that, when we're thinking we have all the solutions, we're neglecting to acknowledge and see the strengths within Indigenous communities. So these are some of the like to share, just showing, again, that culture is proven to protect people from experiencing mental health issues. And really thinking about knowing how all this research is kind of neglected traditional knowledge. What other strengths and resources do Indigenous communities have to offer the field of perinatal mental health or perinatal health? Like, what have we looked over? This list is just from SAMHSA, and it's a list of Indigenous cultural strengths that is just a really helpful place to start. Let's see. These are more examples of Indigenous strengths related to the perinatal population. And really, like, each community, family, and individual is unique. So the most dangerous thing we can ever do is assume. We're not, we need to make sure that our assumptions are like backed by, maybe a knowledge keeper or an Indigenous consultant. Sometimes they call them like, I've seen different like invoices for it. It could be like a Indigenous knowledge keeper or a cultural consultant, things like that. You are going to be able to learn like by engaging with people, but we need to really be mindful of how we're doing that. And I'll explain that more in my next example. But back to the Lifts in Indian Country, the Lifts resource guide. When I first did this, I just took the list that I had and I like online, because it was COVID, tried to find like anything for each tribal community. So I was looking for like pediatricians, mental health therapists, substance use treatment programs, like all of that. And I was just doing my best to try to find those. But I was also learning in school how important culture was. And I realized that I was approaching this with a Eurocentric worldview. And so I finished it and I sent, my final stuff to HMHB, and they sent it to moms. And I was like, it's not too late. You guys can still go to the communities. Like, it needs to be more like, it needs to be the community themselves telling you about this stuff. What I did like wasn't sufficient enough, and it's not even good, really quality, because there's nobody from community saying that this is, this is right, this is accurate. And so they were like, great, do you want to do that? So instead of me just kind of going around and like trying to collect information I could, moms funded us to hold these virtual meetings where we were able to actually pay people for their input, their time, and their feedback. And when we did that, it kept coming up over again that culture was a resource, right? It's a resource for perinatal mental health. And so we were able to use this two-eyed seeing that Albert Marshall, an elder, had coined, two-eyed seeing and health promotion, about looking the best of both worlds, right? So the Western perspective, things like therapists, so that substance use treatment, like things that are important, but we also have to use our Indigenous eye so that we can see language programs, parent language classes, dance dress construction classes, whatever type of cultural programs that community has. Originally, those weren't going to be listed on the resource guide. And how helpful would that have been for an Indigenous person utilizing the guide? So we kind of recognized where we messed up, backtracked, and did our best to better, better include the community in that work and make sure that our cultural strengths were highlighted. The last thing that I talk about in this paper when I'm giving this work, the whole idea was to help policy people and funders and understand like some understand working with tribal communities. And yes, it's like for perinatal mental health, but really a lot of these can translate to other health areas. So when we're talking about evidence-based practices, it's like, well, whose evidence? Whose evidence is that? Or were Native people included in coming up with that evidence? When I was writing this paper, I wanted to, I even before in my graduate school, there's hardly any evidence-based correlation between culture and perinatal mental health. And I put like evidence-based like in quotation marks, because that's not to say that there isn't a correlation between culture and perinatal mental health. It's just like evidence-based. Um, this article by Esther Lucero from 2011 talks about traditional practices and how they're standalone methods developed and used by tribal people long before the concept of evidence-based practices. So I found a literature review that contained 27 studies about Indigenous approaches to perinatal mental health. And from that literature review, only 11 of those interventions were Indigenous led and designed versus culturally adapted. So where something is like designed for the general population and then fit the Indigenous communities or Native communities, it's not necessarily stemming from Indigenous worldviews or values. And that was really interesting because looking at that, it was always the like culturally adapted ones that were more likely to have like specific outcomes. And that's where stuff gets put into evidence-based practices. So, you know, evidence-based practices are important and they have their place, but I think when we're working with tribal communities, especially, we need to really be mindful of how we're utilizing them. Another example that I wanted to give, I really wish Margaret Ann Adams was here to talk about this, but this is her baby. It's something that she's doing a great job. She organized our first Life Blessings, Enhancing Cultural Safety for Indigenous Families. So it's a Life Blessings Day, and it's a kind of immersion experience. And where it comes from is back to cultural safety, that second step, cultural appraisal, where we're starting to develop collaborative relationships with stakeholders and we're starting to look at value differences. And that's a part of how we're learning about the people that we serve. So just to give a brief example of how this was done, we were able, like big picture, nurses from areas that people from Browning or the Blackfeet Reservation are commonly like referred to or transferred to, they were able to come and visit the Blackfeet Reservation. And it's all about having some place to start in building these programmatic relationships. There were already programmatic relationships in place, like people, you know, were referring to like the WIC program or whatnot, but people haven't ever really met face to face, and a lot of the people who participated had never been to a reservation or the Blackfeet Reservation. Let's see. Margaret Ann did a really great job of coordinating this and getting everything set up and making sure that it was kind of rooted in her values as an Indigenous person and as someone who has been a guest on the Blackfeet Reservation for nearly 30 years. So she was able to kind of translate that, the visitors to bring gifts so that they can share them with, to acknowledge that the time that they're taking to meet with them. That was a really powerful thing. It's helping other non-Indigenous people understand the importance of gift giving and reciprocity as an Indigenous value. She also worked within community to first make sure that tribal leadership was aware of it and that they were okay with it. And then she hired a community elder, and this was like a paid position. booked a local venue and paid a local caterer for lunch. So really investing local. Also hired a local like tourism company to assist with transportation around the reservation. But it was grounded in culture. We started at the Blackfeet Community College in their ceremony room. The elder like set the stage, and they were the ones to lead it and talk, have a talking circle. Like I said, we shared a local meal. I think we ate bison. It was so good. It was at the early Head Start. So this is something that Margaret Ann and Deanna are continuing to do. We have one coming up in Fort Belknap, which is exciting. Before they were able to come to the Blackfeet Reservation, they had to do cultural safety training with me. And that was to make sure that people who are coming at least had like this foundation of understanding like being culturally safe, and cultural safety practices and whatnot. So that was really important. But really it's not something that, this is something that can be replicated, I guess is what I'm getting at. This is something that people can do, meet with the reservation that's closest to you, get a hold of someone and say, hey, can we come and visit you guys? Can we have some funding where we can get our nurses there and we can buy lunch, and we just want to get to know your program better. We want to start a good relationship. And I think that's something that I hear a lot from the tribal communities is like, well, they don't know, they don't come here. So people want people to come and see them and see where they're at and get on that common ground. That's what our elders said. It's different when like we're always going to these other places to meet with people, but it's really impactful when people come to the tribal communities. So it was really great. People actually applied to do it. So they wanted to do it, they wanted to participate. And so there was that process and all of that. And they were able to go to the different programs that were related to perinatal health and meet with people. So that investment in really trying to build those relationships and continue to learn about the strengths. And that was a big impact too. The nurses that visited said like, wow, like you can tell that everybody here is working hard to take care of their people. And to me, that meant a lot, especially because I'm always preaching about the strengths. So just some key takeaways. Allyship is not an identity, but it's an ongoing practice. We need to be critical of ourselves and recognize if our interest is coming from a place of saviorism. Appropriation is using or taking something from another culture without giving proper recognition or respect to that culture. And that could also be like taking their identity too. Cultural appreciation is the opposite of appropriation. So make sure to give credit when it's due and invest in this work. It's worth it, and it's important to not ask for free labor of our patients or of our coworkers or of people that we know. So Guinea Hand, thank you. These are all going out. I have PDF of these slides. So these are links to the LIFT resource guide that I talked about, and also the cultural safety toolkit that you can download. Here are the additional resources, and these are in the chat and they're also being sent out. Just gonna check. Can you give an example of how a typical social determinant of health screener in clinical or hospital setting is not appropriate for Indigenous community, and what changes would you recommend? Ooh. I would have to see, I guess, see a screener or see the screener to think about that. I don't think I have enough in front of me, but I think it's more about being inclusive of other things. Like we always talk about, like, wouldn't it be great if some of these screeners would say like, do you feel like you have a strong connection to the land? Or how have you been able to meet with any elders lately? Have you been able to access ceremony and culture lately, things like that. And so when we're thinking of social determinants of health, like I think that that relationship to the land is something that's often, it's kind of considered like environmental health, but for an Indigenous person, like if your land is not good and like it's affecting the berry season, or it's affecting the health of the animals that you are used to hunting and whatnot, like that can be important to recognize and make sure. And so if someone is interested in redoing or making a specific social determinants of health screener, I think that's something that is worth like investing in, and hiring like an Indigenous consultant. Or I've seen some clinics that actually have an Indigenous or elder advisory board. So all good ways to get something like that done.
Thank you.
Oh, the topic of hair. I know okay, we still got 3 minutes. Yeah. So thanks. Thanks for bringing that up about the topic of hair and what it means to a Native. Um, I think I'll always start by saying it's different. It's different for each tribe and community and person. But what I was taught about my hair from my auntie in Rocky Boy, because my dad's mom was from Rocky Boy, Ruby Chief Goes Out Stiff Arm. And in my house, even though I grew up in Fort Belknap, that's the culture that we go by, and that like we Sundance and Rocky Boy and all of that. So I remember growing up in Fort Belknap, a lot of my friends who were Nakota or Aani, whenever someone in their family would die, they would cut their hair in as an act of mourning, because our hair is like powerful and it's sacred, and it's like a part of our identity. And so they would braid their hair and cut it and put it with their loved one who had passed away. And so I was like confused, how come I never did that? How come, nobody does that when we're at funerals in Rocky Boy? And how come, I just had all these questions. And so my dad had my auntie come talk to me about it. And she said that for us, like, we're supposed to keep our hair long because it makes our spirit happy. And taking that a step further, during the assimilation, the federal Indian policy of assimilation in boarding schools, that was the first thing that they did, is that they would cut people's hair. And I've heard stories about how traumatizing that was, especially for the tribes that do cut their hair as an act of mourning. The children didn't understand why their hair was being cut. They assumed that somebody had died back home, and they didn't know. And so they were all having short hair and that was their belief, right? That you kept your hair long unless you were in mourning. So they didn't understand. And so hair, I've been a part of research projects where we want to, like, people want to collect hair, so we have to be really careful with that. And sometimes people don't want that hair to be like thrown away or other people to have it. Sometimes at haircuts, it's really common for people to want their hair and want to take their hair home with them versus it be thrown away. And yeah, there's a lot of nuances with hair. So at that one research project, what we came up with was we take the hair and we literally only needed like a snippet of it, and then we give the rest back. Like, instead of like, having this big long thing about what we're going to do with the hair, we just give it right back to them, and then it's up to them what they want to do with their hair. But always being mindful, some tribes in doing research, they would rather do blood tests or something than taking hair because of that. So it's really, hair is very sacred to Indigenous people. So like touching their hair without asking, or even asking to touch somebody's hair, like it can make people really uncomfortable. And I would say that that's even a form of emotional labor too. Over time in my explanation. So yeah, thank you all for your questions and for your time. Unless there are any other questions or something, Stephanie.
no, I just want to thank everyone for coming and for participating in this cultural safety series. I think this was the absolute best possible final echo that we could have had for moms. And so thank you to everyone, not only for joining today, but for being part of this over the last 5 years. We do plan to continue doing educational series, but it just won't be at this time, and it'll be a little more sporadic through the end of our award period in September. So thank you. We hope everyone has a great spring, summer, and thank you again, Amy, for joining us and sharing this with us for our final echo.
Thank you. Bye.